What if the stronger side had won? Not the side we think of as stronger. I am talking about the side that actually had more soldiers, more ships, and more gold. In our world, money is much more than just paper or numbers on a screen. It is a promise. For decades, the biggest promise in history was held between two countries that do not even like each other. On one side, you have the greatest factory the world has ever seen. On the other, you have the world's biggest bank. China makes the things. America buys them. But there is a middle step that most people never think about. When you buy a plastic toy or a new phone made in China, your dollars leave your bank account and head across the ocean. But the Chinese government cannot just spend those dollars at home. They need their own currency to pay their workers and build their cities. So they do something strange. They take those piles of American cash and they lend them right back to the United States. They buy things called treasury bonds. These are essentially IOUs from the American government. It is a massive, invisible cycle that has been running for a long time. China sells goods, gets dollars, and then uses those dollars to buy American debt. This has built up into a mountain of debt worth nearly $1 trillion. For years, experts called this a marriage of convenience. Some even called it a suicide pact. As long as China keeps buying these bonds, the American government can keep spending. And as long as Americans keep spending, Chinese factories keep running. It is the ultimate win-win. Or at least, it was for a long time. But what if that marriage ended tomorrow? What if the factory decided it did not want the bank's IOUs anymore? This is often called the nuclear option. It is the idea that China could destroy the American economy just by selling its bonds. To understand why this is so scary, you have to understand what a bond actually is. Think of it like a global price tag for money. When a lot of people want to buy these bonds, the cost of borrowing money stays low. When interest rates are low, life is easy. You can buy a house, you can start a business, the government can build roads and bridges without worrying about the cost. But if a major player like China suddenly dumps all their bonds at once, the price of those bonds crashes. And when the price of bonds goes down, interest rates go up. They do not just go up a little bit. They spike. This is the lever that controls the entire world. It is the heartbeat of the global financial system. For 30 years, that heartbeat has been steady and predictable. We have grown used to the idea that the world will always want American debt. We assume the dollar will always be the king of the mountain. We assume that if we want to buy something, someone will always be there to lend us the money. But trust is a fragile thing. It is the only thing that makes a piece of paper valuable. In our story, that trust is about to vanish. The world we live in is built on a foundation of debt held by someone who might not want to hold it anymore. It is a quiet relationship that happens in the background of our lives every single day. You do not see the bonds. You do not see the central banks. You just see the price of milk or the interest rate on your car loan. But everything you see is connected to this one giant pile of IOUs sitting in a vault in Beijing. It is the ultimate weapon because it does not require a single bullet. It does not require a single soldier or a single tank. All it takes is a few clicks on a keyboard. All it takes is a few orders sent to the bond market. In the real world, this is just a theory. It is a what if that keeps people in expensive suits awake at night. But in this story, the theory becomes real. The nuclear option is no longer a threat. It is a reality. Imagine a world where the factory finally decides it has enough paper. It wants something real instead. This is how the world, as we know it, begins to end. It does not start with a bang. It starts with a sell order. To see how this falls apart, we have to look at the very moment the decision was made. It was not a moment of anger. It was a moment of cold, hard math. And once that math changed, there was no going back. The marriage was over. The divorce would be the most expensive event in human history. It started on a Tuesday morning. In Beijing, the sun was just beginning to rise over the city. The people working at the central bank did not look like soldiers. They did not carry weapons. They wore tailored suits and drank tea. But they were about to launch an attack that would change the world forever. For years, There had been rumors of this moment. Economists called it a theoretical risk. Politicians called it a bluff. They assumed that China would never actually do it, because it would hurt them too much. It was like a game of chicken where both cars are heading for a cliff. But that morning, the drivers stopped caring about the cliff. A single order was sent to the trading desks in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and London. The order was simple: sell. Sell every American Treasury bond we own, and do not stop until they are all gone. In the world of finance, normally you sell things slowly. If you have $1 billion worth of something, you sell a little bit every day so you do not scare the market. If you sell too fast, the price drops and you lose money. But this was not about making a profit. This was about breaking a system. China owned nearly $1 trillion in American debt. That is a number so big it is hard to even imagine. If you spent $1 every second, it would take you over 30,000 years to reach 1 trillion. And now, all of that weight was hitting the market at once. In New York, it was still Monday night. The traders who worked the late shifts were the first to see the red numbers on their screens. At first, they thought it was a mistake, maybe a computer glitch or a typo by a tired clerk. They saw $1 billion worth of bonds hit the market in 10 minutes. Then another 5 billion. Then 10. The price of American debt began to fall. When the price of a bond falls, the interest rate, the yield goes up. It is like a seesaw. As the price crashed, the interest rate started to climb. 4%, 5%, 6%. These might sound like small numbers, but in the bond market, they're earthquakes. By midnight in New York, the news reached the highest levels of the American government. Phones started ringing in the dark bedrooms of people who run the world. They were told that the largest buyer of American debt had just become the largest seller. There was no one big, enough to buy what China was selling. The market was becoming a one-way street. Usually, the American government can count on other countries to step in. They expect Japan or Europe or big private banks to see a low price and start buying. But that night, nobody wanted to touch it. If the biggest holder is dumping everything, you do not want to be the person catching the falling knife. The panic started to spread beyond the bond traders. If the American government has to pay more interest on its debt, everything else gets more expensive too. The cost of money itself was changing in real time. By the time the sun came up in New York, the news was everywhere. It was not just a financial story anymore. It was a national security crisis. The White House called Beijing. They wanted to know why this was happening. They wanted to know if it was a mistake or an act of war. The answer from Beijing was polite and cold. They said they were simply diversifying their portfolio. They said they no longer felt that American debt was a safe place for their money. It was the ultimate insult delivered in the language of a bank statement. The marriage was officially over. The papers had been signed in the middle of the night, and now the rest of the world had to deal with the fallout. The screens in every bank in the world were flashing red. The system that had held the global economy together for 50 years was snapping. In those first few hours, if this could be stopped, they thought maybe the Federal Reserve could just print enough money to buy all the bonds back. But printing $1 trillion to stop a crash is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The trust was gone. And without trust, the dollar is just a piece of green paper. The world was entering the first 72 hours of a new era, an era where the rules of the last century no longer applied. The first domino had fallen, and the next one was much closer to home than anyone realized. The first 72 hours were not really about money. They were about fear. Imagine a giant machine that runs the entire world. This machine is invisible, but it is everywhere. It is called the bond market. Every bank, every pension fund, and every insurance company in the world depends on this machine. They all hold American bonds because they are supposed to be the safest things on earth. They are the foundation of everything. But by Wednesday morning, the foundation was cracking. The screens in every trading room in London and New York were solid red. Usually, when the stock market drops too fast, the exchanges pull a lever. They call it a circuit breaker. They stop the trading for 15 minutes to let everyone calm down. It is like a timeout in a high-stakes game. But that day, the circuit breakers did not help. Every time the market reopened, the price of bonds dropped another 5%. By noon, the limit down rules had been triggered 3 times. The people whose job it is to keep the market moving simply stopped answering their phones. In the world of finance, if there are no buyers, the price does not just go down. The price disappears. You look at your screen and you see a number, but you cannot actually sell your bonds at that price. There is no one on the other side of the trade. This is what experts call a liquidity crisis, but it feels more like a heart attack. The blood stops moving. By the second day, the panic had moved from the banks to the streets. People do not usually check the bond market while they are eating breakfast, but they do notice when their banking apps stop working. Banks use bonds as collateral to lend money to each other every single night. It is the plumbing of the financial world. When the price of bonds is crashing, the banks do not know what those bonds are worth. So, they stop lending. When the banks stop lending to each other, they stop lending to you. Automatic payments for mortgages and car loans started to fail. Credit card companies began lowering people's limits without warning. ATM machines in several major cities started running out of cash as people got nervous. The Great Divorce was no longer a headline in a newspaper. It was happening at the grocery store checkout line. At 3 a.m. on Thursday, the Federal Reserve held an emergency meeting. The building in Washington was glowing with lights while the rest of the city slept. They had to make a choice. They could let the market crash and watch the entire banking system fail, or they could print money and buy the bonds themselves. They chose to print. In just 1 hour, they created $200 billion out of thin air. They used that money to buy the bonds that China was dumping. They thought this would show the world that the American government was still in control. They thought it would prove that the dollar was still king. But they were wrong. When the world saw the Fed printing hundreds of billions of dollars in a single morning, they did not feel safe. They felt terrified. It was a signal that the situation was out of control. If the only way to save the dollar was to print more of it, the dollar itself was losing its value. Investors in Europe and the Middle East started to ask a dangerous question. If China is getting out, why are we still here? Suddenly, the sell orders were not just coming from Beijing. They were coming from everywhere. By the end of the 3rd day, the world's reserve currency was in a free fall. The interest rate on a 10-year Treasury bond had doubled in 72 hours. In our normal world, a move like that would take 10 years. In this world, it happened over a long weekend. The first phase was over. The market had broken. Now, the consequences were about to reach the front doors of every home in America. Because when the price of the government's debt goes up, the price of everything else follows it. And the spike was just beginning. By Thursday morning, the chaos in the big banks started to leak into the real world. Most people do not spend their time thinking about bond yields. They do not follow the ups and downs of debt markets in faraway cities. But they do care about one thing. They care about the cost of their own lives. And that cost was about to change forever because of what happened in Beijing. To understand why, you have to look at how a bank works. When you go to a bank to buy a house, they do not just give you their own money. They are essentially borrowing that money from the global market and lending it to you. The price they pay to borrow that money is tied directly to those government bonds. If the government has to pay 5% interest to borrow money, your mortgage is going to be higher than that. Usually, it is a very stable relationship. If the bond rate moves a tiny bit, your mortgage rate stays about the same. But the bond market was no longer moving a tiny bit. It was exploding. Imagine a young couple in a suburb outside of Chicago. Let us call them Sarah and Mike. They had been saving for 5 years to buy their first home. They had finally found a small house with a yard for their dog. On Monday, they had a locked-in interest rate of 4%. That meant their monthly payment was something they could afford. It was a number they had written on their fridge. But on Thursday morning, Sarah got a phone call from her loan officer. The man on the other end of the line sounded like he had not slept in days. He told her that the lock on their rate was gone. The bank was canceling all pending loans. If they wanted the house now, the new interest rate was not 4%, it was 12%. Sarah did the math in her head and felt the air leave her lungs. Their monthly payment had just doubled. The house they had dreamed of was gone in a single phone call. And they were not alone. Across the entire country, millions of people were getting the same call. The housing market did not just slow down. It hit a brick wall at 100 miles per hour. When interest rates spike that fast, nobody buys anything. Real estate agents saw every single one of their deals fall apart in a single afternoon. Construction companies stopped building because they could no longer afford the loans to buy wood and steel. But it was not just houses. Think about a small business owner who needs a loan to buy a new delivery truck. Every single person who needed to borrow money was suddenly facing a mountain of interest. The price of money had become too high for normal people to pay. This is the real power of the weapon China had used. They did not have to invade a single beach. They just had to make it impossible for an American family to afford a roof over their heads. By Friday, the shockwaves reached the car dealerships. The rows of shiny new cars sat empty. No one was signing papers because no one could afford the debt. The American economy is built on a foundation of cheap borrowing. We buy our lives today and pay for them tomorrow. But that tomorrow had finally arrived, and the bill was more than anyone could handle. The people in charge of the money tried to tell the public to remain calm. They said this was a temporary shock. They promised that things would settle down once the market found its new level. But the market could not find a level, because the biggest buyer was still selling. The giant pile of debt was still being dumped into the ocean. Every time a new batch of bonds was sold, the interest rates ticked up another notch. It was a feedback loop of pain. The more the rates went up, the more the economy slowed down. And the more the economy slowed down, the less people trusted the future. The American dream has always been tied to the idea of owning something. A home, a car, a piece of the future. But that dream was being sold off, one bond at a time. For the first time in a generation, the ladder of success had been pulled up. And the people at the bottom were looking up at a height they could no longer reach. The era of easy money was dead. And in its place was a cold, hard reality that no one was prepared for. But while Americans were looking at their bank accounts, something else was happening. The dollar itself was starting to lose its crown. If the world did not want American debt, did they still want American cash? That was the question that would define the next week of the crisis. Money is just a story we all agree to believe in, but by the second week of the crisis, people were starting to forget the words. For almost 100 years, the American dollar was the king of the world. It did not matter if you were in Tokyo, London, or a small village in Brazil. If you had dollars, you had power. You could buy oil, you could buy food, you could buy safety. The dollar was the reserve currency. That is a fancy way of saying it was the one thing everyone in the world wanted to hold. Central banks kept piles of it in their vaults just in case something went wrong. It was the ultimate insurance policy. Because the dollar was so strong, Americans got a special deal. Everything we bought from other countries was cheaper for us than it was for anyone else. We could print our own money and the rest of the world would trade their hard work and resources for it. It was a superpower that did not require a single soldier. But that superpower depended on one simple thing: trust. The world trusted that the dollar would always be worth something. They trusted that the American government would always pay its debts. But China's decision to dump its bonds had shattered that trust. When the biggest holder of your debt says they don't want it anymore, everyone else starts looking for the exit. Imagine you are a fruit seller in a busy market. You have a currency that everyone has used for years. Then, one day, the biggest merchant in the market stands up and yells that your coins are worthless. He starts throwing his coins into the street. What do? You do not wait to see if he is right. You stop taking those coins immediately. This is exactly what started to happen with the dollar. In the Middle East, countries that sell oil have always priced their oil in dollars. This was called the petrodollar. It meant that if any country in the world wanted to keep its lights on, it had to buy dollars first. It was a huge part of what kept the dollar strong. But as the bond market crashed, the oil-producing nations held an emergency meeting. They saw the value of the dollar dropping every hour. They realized that if they kept selling their oil for dollars, they were basically giving their oil away for free. By Wednesday of the second week, they made an announcement that shook the world. They would start accepting other currencies for oil: gold, euros, even the Chinese yuan. Suddenly, the world did not need dollars as much as it used to. The demand for American cash vanished overnight. When nobody wants your money, the value of that money falls off a cliff. Think about what this means for a normal person. If you take $100 to the grocery store, you expect it to buy a certain amount of food. But if the value of the dollar drops by half, that $100 only buys $50 worth of food. This is not just inflation. This is a collapse of purchasing power. American travelers at airports in Europe and Asia found that their credit cards were being declined. Not because they didn't have money in the bank, but because the merchants did not know what those dollars would be worth by the time the transaction cleared. "We don't take dollars today" became a common phrase in cities around the globe. It was a humiliation that no one thought was possible. Inside the United States, the prices of imported goods began to skyrocket. Electronics, clothing, medicine, anything that was not made inside American borders suddenly cost 2 or 3 times as much. The era of the cheap dollar was over. The American government tried to fight back. They told the world that the dollar was still backed by the strongest military and the biggest economy. But you cannot eat a tank, and you cannot build a house with a fighter jet. The world wanted real value, and they were no longer sure the dollar could provide it. People began to talk about a multipolar world. A world where there wasn't just one king, but many smaller ones. But a world with many kings is a world of constant conflict. The Great Divorce was spreading beyond just the banks. It was splitting the entire global map into 2 different camps: those who still believed in the old system, and those who were ready to burn it down. China was already moving to the next phase of their plan. They knew they couldn't just destroy the dollar and walk away. They needed something to replace the paper they had just thrown away. They were about to trade their digital numbers for something you can touch and hold. They were going after the things the world is actually made of. While the rest of the world was staring at computer screens in a panic, the leaders in Beijing were looking at something much older. They were looking at a map of the Earth. They knew that the bonds they had sold were just digital promises. They knew the dollars they were getting in return were losing value every hour. Holding on to that much cash was like holding a large block of ice in the middle of a desert. If they did not move fast, their entire national wealth would simply melt away into nothing. So, they did something that changed the physical world as much as the financial one. They stopped buying paper, they started buying everything else, they went on the biggest shopping spree in human history. But they weren't buying luxury cars or expensive houses. They were buying the things that every person on Earth needs to survive. They were buying the things that every factory needs to build: copper, cobalt, lithium, iron, oil, wheat, soybeans. They did not just buy what they needed for the next month, they tried to buy every ounce of these resources they could find on the entire planet. Imagine you are the owner of a copper mine in South America. On Monday, your phone starts ringing. They do not want to negotiate. They offer to pay 3 times the current market price, and they want to pay right now. You take the deal. Everyone takes the deal. Within a week, the world's supply of the most important metals was spoken for. If you were a small electronics company in Germany or a car builder in Japan, you suddenly had a massive problem. You went to buy the materials you needed to make your products, and you found the shelves were empty. The price of copper did not just go up 10% or 20%. It went up 500% in a single week. This is what happens when the factory of the world decides it wants to own the raw materials too. China realized that you cannot eat a treasury bond. You cannot build a battery out of a digital dollar. In a world where trust in money is dying, the person with the most dirt and metal wins. They were trading their melting cash for things that would last for 100 years. This created a secondary shockwave that was even worse than the first one. The first shockwave was about bank accounts. The second one was about the things in your house. Think about a simple loaf of bread. If one country decides to buy up half the world's supply of wheat in a single month, the price of flour in your local store is going to explode. Farmers in the American Midwest were getting offers for their crops that they had never seen before. Trucks and ships were being diverted in the middle of the ocean. A ship full of grain heading for Europe would suddenly turn around and head for a port in China because the buyer there had outbid everyone else. Contracts that had existed for decades were being broken. Lawsuits did not matter anymore. People wanted the physical goods. The global supply chain, which was already fragile, began to snap into pieces. This was the moment the Great Divorce became physical. It was no longer just about who owed who money. It was about who had the oil to run their trucks and who had the grain to feed their people. For a long time, we believed that wealth was a number in a bank account. We thought that as long as we had enough zeros on a screen, we were rich. But the resource shift proved that wealth is actually the stuff you can touch. If you have $1 billion but no one will sell you a gallon of gasoline, how rich are you really? The United States and Europe watched as their influence over the world's resources vanished. For a century, the dollar had been the passport that let America go anywhere and buy anything. Now, that passport was being rejected at every border. The nations of Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia saw the writing on the wall. They saw that the old king was losing his crown. They began to side with the player who was offering them real, physical value. They traded their minerals and their land for Chinese infrastructure and Chinese goods. The map of the world was being redrawn in real time. In Washington, the government tried to pass laws to stop the drain of resources. They tried to ban the export of certain metals and grains. But it was too late. The deals had already been made. The grain was already on the ships. The metal was already in the containers. The era of resources had begun. And while the world was fighting over the last scraps of copper and wheat, the Great Divorce was heading for its next stage. The world was about to be split in two, not by a wall of bricks and wire, but by a wall of different systems. Two worlds that no longer spoke the same financial language. For a long time, we lived in a world of magic. We did not call it magic. We called it shopping. You could walk into a store with $20 and walk out with a bag full of things. Clothes, kitchen tools, toys for your kids. Most of those things had a small sticker on the bottom that said Made in China. We never really thought about how they got there. We never thought about why they were so cheap. It was just the way the world worked. But that magic was powered by the system that was now falling apart. The cheap goods era was over. And it did not end with a whimper. It ended with empty shelves. By the third week of the crisis, the local big box stores started to look different. The rows of television sets that used to be on sale for $300 were gone. The bins of plastic containers and cheap electronics were empty. At first, people thought it was just a temporary delay. They thought the trucks were stuck in traffic or the ships were late. But the truth was much worse. The ships were not coming at all. Remember, the Chinese government had decided they did not want American dollars anymore. If they do not want your money, why would they send you their goods? For 30 years, China had been sending us their hard work and their resources. In exchange, we sent them digital numbers on a screen. It was a trade that favored us more than it favored them. But now, the factory had closed its doors to the American buyer. Without the Made in China sticker, the American store started to feel very small. We realized that we did not actually make much for ourselves anymore. We had traded our factories for office buildings and coffee shops. We had become a nation of consumers who forgot how to be producers. And now, there was nothing left to consume. The items that were still on the shelves started to have new price tags. The price of a simple t-shirt did not go up by a few cents. It tripled. A box of shoes that used to cost $50 now cost $150. People stood in the aisles looking at the prices in silence. They were waiting for a sale that was never going to happen. This was the domestic fallout. It was the moment the global crisis sat down at your dinner table. It was not just about luxury items or big electronics. It was about the basics of everyday life. Think about your phone or your laptop. Almost every part inside them comes from a global network that depends on the dollar being strong. When the dollar crashed, the cost of those parts went through the roof. Fixing a broken screen suddenly cost more than the phone was worth. Buying a new computer became a major life event, like buying a car used to be. We were moving from a world of throw it away to a world of make it last. The just-in-time world was breaking. We used to live in a system where things were made exactly when they were needed. There were no big warehouses full of extra supplies. Everything was moving on a ship or a truck at all times. But when the money stopped working, the movement stopped too. The grocery stores were the hardest hit. Even if the food was grown in America, the trucks needed gas to move it. And the price of that gas was tied to the global oil market that no longer liked the dollar. Simple things like oranges or coffee became rare treats. Limit 2 per customer signs appeared on things we used to buy by the dozen. The psychological impact was massive. Americans had grown up believing that abundance was a birthright. We believed that the store would always be full and the prices would always be low. Now, for the first time in generations, we were seeing the bottom of the bin. It felt like the country was shrinking. People started to stay home more. They stopped driving because the gas was too expensive. They stopped ordering things online because the shipping cost more than the item. The hum of the American economy was fading into a quiet stillness. We were learning a very hard lesson about where our things come from. We were learning that our lifestyle was built on a foundation of debt and trust. And since both of those were gone, the lifestyle had to go too. But as the stores emptied out, a new kind of map was being drawn. The world was not just getting poorer, it was getting divided. The Great Divorce was about to create 2 completely different realities. One world would be built around the old dollar. The other would be built around something new. And the line between them was becoming a wall that no one could cross. The world used to be one single piece of glass. If you lived in London, you could buy a car made in Germany with parts from Japan. If you lived in New York, you could use an app built in India to order a shirt made in Vietnam. Everything was connected. We called it globalization. But really, it was just one giant shared system. And the center of that system was the American dollar. But after the bond market crashed and the resources shifted, the glass did not just crack, it shattered. And when glass shatters, you cannot just glue it back together. This was the beginning of what people started to call the Great Divorce. It was the moment the world split into 2 separate, competing realities. For 50 years, the goal of every country was to be part of the global market. Now, the goal was to pick the right side. Imagine a line drawn right through the middle of the planet. On one side, you have the Western world. This side is led by the United States and Europe. They still use the old banking systems. They still try to protect the value of the dollar and the euro. They have their own internet, their own apps, and their own rules. On the other side, you have the Eastern world. This side is led by China and its new allies. They do not use the dollar anymore. They have built their own banking system that does not need a single American bank to work. They have their own satellites, their own GPS, and their own version of the internet. It was like the world had developed 2 different operating systems, and they were not compatible with each other. If you lived in the Western world, your credit card would not work in the Eastern world. If you lived in the Eastern world, you could not even access the websites or news from the West. The Berlin Wall had returned, but this time it was made of code and bank accounts. For the countries stuck in the middle, life became a nightmare. Think about a country like India or Brazil or South Africa. For decades, they had done business with everyone. They sold to America and they bought from China. But now, the 2 leaders were telling them they had to choose. You could not be friends with both anymore. If you wanted to buy Chinese oil, you had to use the Chinese system. But if you used the Chinese system, the Americans would cut you off from their technology. It was a global game of us versus them. Many countries started to split internally. Politicians fought over which side offered a better future. Some chose the West because they wanted the old freedoms and the old alliances. Others chose the East because they wanted the physical resources and the new infrastructure. The global map started to look like a patchwork quilt of competing interests. The Great Divorce changed how we thought about the future. We used to think the world was getting smaller and more united. We thought we were all becoming one big global family. Now, we realized we were more like neighbors who had stopped speaking to each other. We lived in different worlds, even if we shared the same border. This split made everything more expensive and more difficult. In the old world, if one factory closed, you just bought from another one. In the new world, if your side didn't make it, you didn't have it. Innovation slowed down because scientists on one side were not allowed to talk to scientists on the other side. The Great Divorce was not just a financial event. It was a cultural and social earthquake. Families were split across the line. Businesses that had existed for 100 years went bankrupt because their customers were suddenly on the wrong side of the wall. The world was becoming a more dangerous place because there was no longer a shared interest in keeping the peace. In the old world, China and America didn't want to fight because they were too busy making money together. In the new world, they didn't make money together anymore. The divorce was final. And as the years went by, the memory of the one world started to fade. A new generation was growing up that didn't remember what it was like to be connected to everyone. They only knew their side of the wall. But what did this new world actually look like on the ground? If you fast forward 50 years, the results are even more shocking. The very idea of what it means to be a wealthy country had changed. 50 years have passed since the morning the screens in Beijing turned red. The world that existed before that day is now a story, told by grandparents to children who find it hard to believe. To a person living 50 years in the future, the idea of a global reserve currency sounds like a myth from a lost civilization. They find it strange that there was once a time when a single piece of green paper was accepted in every corner of the map. In this new world, wealth is not something you carry in a wallet. It is something you carry in your identity. The planet is no longer a single marketplace where everyone shops at the same stores. It is a collection of fortress economies. If you live in the Western world, your life is defined by the limits of your own region. The vast, sprawling trade routes that once connected the American Midwest to the factories of the East are gone. In their place is a system that is much smaller and much more expensive. The United States has become a very large island. It is still powerful, but it is no longer the center of the universe. Most of the things you use in your daily life are grown or made within a few hundred miles of where you sleep. A simple tool or a piece of clothing is a precious object, because it cannot be easily replaced by a ship coming from across the ocean. People have learned how to fix things again. They have learned how to make things last for decades because the era of cheap and disposable died when the bonds were sold. In the Eastern world, the reality is completely different. It is a world built on the physical control of resources. The children, they grow up in a system where the government manages every drop of oil and every ounce of grain. They do not use cash at all. They use digital credits that are backed by the actual piles of gold and copper held in state vaults. If you have credits, you have a share of the nation's physical strength. But those credits only work within their own walls. The Great Divorce has become so deep that the two sides of the world barely even look at each other anymore. There are no more global anymore. There are no more global movies. There are no more global stars. The internet has been sliced into two separate gardens. If you are on one side, the other side is a dark space where you cannot go. The most shocking change is how people think about the future. In the old world, people saved money because they believed it would be worth more later. They believed the system would always be there to protect their work. In the new world, people do not trust the future. They trust the present. They trust the land they can walk on and the people they can see with their own eyes. The nuclear option did not just blow up the banks. It blew up the idea of global progress. We no longer believe that we are all heading toward the same destination. We are just trying to survive in our own separate corners. The massive cities of the old world have become quieter. The giant shipping ports that once handled thousands of containers a day are mostly empty. They are like the ruins of a time when we thought we could own the whole world at once. But in this new, fragmented world, something else has grown. Communities have become tighter. People depend on their neighbors in a way they haven't since the 1800s. When you cannot rely on a global bank, you have to rely on the person next door. The Great Divorce was a tragedy for the global economy, but it was a homecoming for the local one. It is a harder life. It is a more expensive life. But for the people living 50 years later, it is the only life they know. They look at the old history books and they see a world that was moving too fast. They see a world that was held together by a promise that was too big to keep. They see a world that was waiting for someone to pull the plug. And they are the ones living in the silence that followed. The story of the bond dump is no longer a lesson about finance. It is the origin story of their entire civilization. It is the moment the one world became two. But even after 50 years, the shadow of that Tuesday morning is still long. The ripples of that one decision are still moving through the water. Because when you destroy trust on a global scale, it takes more than a lifetime to build it back. It takes 1,000 years. Trust is like a forest. It takes hundreds of years to grow, but only a single afternoon to burn down. In the old world, we lived in the shade of that forest. We didn't even notice the trees, because they had always been there. We took it for granted that a promise made by a government was as solid as a mountain. But after the Great Divorce, that forest never grew back. Not in 10 years. Not in 100 years. Not in 1,000 years. History changed because the very idea of trust was deleted from the human brain. Before the crash, humanity believed in a concept called the future. We believed that tomorrow would be better than today. We believed that if we worked hard and saved our money, that money would be there to take care of us. This belief allowed us to build massive things. It allowed us to build cities and flight and the internet. But once the bond market was used as a weapon, that belief died. Future historians look back at our time as a strange, golden window that slammed shut. They call it the era of paper dreams. They see a world where people actually believed that a digital number on a screen was real wealth. In the 1,000 years that followed the crash, humanity went back to the basics. The world became much slower. It became much more cautious. If you wanted to buy something from a stranger, you didn't offer him a credit card or a bank transfer. You offered him something he could hold in his hand. A bag of grain, a piece of silver, a gallon of fuel. The long shadow of the bond dump was a permanent return to the physical world. This changed how empires were built. In our time, an empire was built on influence and debt. In the New World, an empire was only as big as the land it could physically protect. The Great Divorce had proved that global connections were a trap. It proved that if you depend on someone else for your survival, they can kill you without firing a shot. So, every nation and every city became obsessed with being alone. They wanted to be self-sufficient. This sounds like a good thing, but it meant that progress almost stopped. In the old world, a scientist in California could work with a scientist in Beijing to solve a disease. In the New World, those two people never even knew each other existed. The collective brain of humanity was split in two. We became half as smart and twice as scared. The American era became a legend, like Atlantis or Rome. People told stories about a time when you could get on a plane and fly across an entire ocean in a single day. They told stories about stores that were always full of food from every continent. To the people living in the shadow, these stories sounded like fairy tales. They couldn't imagine a world where everyone trusted each other that much. They saw trust as a weakness that their ancestors had paid for in blood and hunger. The Great Divorce had rewritten the social contract. It taught humanity that the only thing you truly own is what you can touch with your fingers. This made the world more stable, but it also made it much darker. There were fewer wars over money, but there were more wars over dirt. There was less debt, but there was also less hope. The nuclear option had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had destroyed the old order forever, but it had also destroyed the bridge to the future. And for 1,000 years, humanity lived on two separate islands, staring across a gap that no one dared to cross. It was a long, quiet era of safety without growth. A world where the lesson of the bond war was carved into every heart. Never trust a promise. Only trust the ground. Looking back at this story, we have to ask ourselves what it really tells us. It is not just a story about banks and bonds. It is a story about the three hard truths that run our world right now. The first truth is that debt is a weapon that can blow up in your own hand. For years, we thought that China holding $1 trillion of American debt was a one-way street. We thought they had a gun to America's head. But we forgot something very important about debt. If you owe the bank $10,000, the bank owns you. But if you owe the bank $1 trillion, you own the bank. China and America were tied together at the waist. If China tried to drown America by dumping its debt, they would be pulled underwater too. In our story, they were willing to take that risk. They decided that the pain of the crash was worth the power they would gain. But in the real world, that is a terrifying choice to make. It means destroying your own savings just to hurt your neighbor. It is the ultimate lose-lose scenario. The second hard truth is that trust is the most valuable resource on the planet. It is more valuable than gold. It is more valuable than oil. Our entire economy is actually a ghost story. It is built on a ghost called trust. We all agree to believe that the dollar has value. We all agree to believe that a promise made today will be kept tomorrow. Once you break that trust on purpose, the ghost vanishes. And once the ghost is gone, you realize that the world is just a collection of strangers. You cannot run a global factory or a global bank with strangers who do not trust each other. The system only works if we all believe it works. In our story, the Great Divorce happened because one side stopped believing. And as we saw, it took 1,000 years for that trust to even start to grow back. The third truth is that the physical world always wins in the end. We have spent decades building a world of digital numbers and paper promises. We thought we were rich because our bank accounts had a lot of zeros. But when the bonds were dumped, we learned the truth. You cannot eat a bond. You cannot build a battery out of a digital dollar. You cannot keep your family warm with a stock market report. Real wealth is the grain in the silo. Real wealth is the copper in the ground and the oil in the pipe. The resource shift proved that the person with the most stuff wins. The digital world is a luxury that only exists when the physical world is peaceful. If the peace breaks, the digital world is the first thing to disappear. These three lessons are the real shadow of the nuclear option. They show us that our world is much more fragile than we like to think. We are all living in a system that depends on everyone playing by the rules. If even one major player decides to burn the rulebook, the whole game ends. We learned that we are all much more connected than we wanted to be. We learned that paper is just paper, but the earth is forever. But there is one final question we have to answer. If this weapon is so powerful, why hasn't it been used yet? What is actually keeping the peace in the real world? In the final part of our story, we are going to look at the reality check. We are going to see why the Great Divorce hasn't happened in our world. And we are going to see what is actually standing between us and the crash. So why hasn't this happened yet? If the weapon is so powerful, why is it still sitting in the box? The answer is simple but terrifying. China and America are like two people standing in a room that is ankle deep in gasoline. One person has a match. The other has a lighter. They both know that if one of them decides to start a fire, they both burn to death. This is what economists call financial mutually assured destruction. In our story, we imagined a world where China was willing to pull the trigger anyway. But in the real world, the leaders in Beijing are very careful. They have spent 40 years building their country into a global power. They have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They did all of that by being part of the global system, not by destroying it. If China decided to dump its bonds tomorrow, the first person they would hurt is themselves. Remember, they own nearly $1 trillion of that debt. If they start selling it fast, the price of those bonds drops immediately. By the time they sold the second half of their pile, it would be worth almost nothing. They would be setting fire to their own national savings. It would be the biggest self-inflicted financial wound in history. And it does not stop with the bank accounts. Think about the factories. China is the factory of the world because Americans and Europeans buy their things. If the American economy collapses, who is going to buy the phones and the toys? Who is going to buy the cars and the clothes? If the customers disappear, the factories in China have to close their doors. When factories close, millions of people lose their jobs. And when millions of people lose their jobs, they get angry at their own government. The leaders in China care about one thing more than anything else. They care about stability at home. They are not going to break the world if it means they lose control of their own house. Then there is the problem of the alternative. If China sells its dollars, what do they buy instead? As we saw in our story, they are trying to buy resources like copper and oil. But there is not enough copper in the world to soak up $1 trillion. There is not enough gold in all the vaults on Earth to replace the dollar. The world is simply too big for any other currency to take over right now. The euro has its own problems. The Japanese yen is not big enough. The Chinese yuan is not yet trusted enough by other countries to be the king. So, for now, the dollar stays on the throne because there is no one else to take the crown. We are stuck in a marriage that neither side really likes anymore. We argue. We threaten each other. We look for ways to be more independent. But at the end of the day, we still share the same bank account. This is what actually keeps the peace. It is not that we have suddenly become friends, it is that we are too connected to fight. The nuclear option is a great story for a movie or a script. It is a scary thought that keeps us awake at night. But in the real world, it serves as a warning. It reminds us that our wealth is built on a foundation of cooperation. It reminds us that we are all living in the same house. We might live in different rooms, but if the foundation cracks, we all feel the floor move. The great divorce has not happened yet because the cost of the lawyers is too high. We continue to trade, and we continue to lend, because the alternative is too dark to imagine. The real world is a balance of pain. And as long as the pain of staying together is less than the pain of breaking up, the system holds. We live in a world of promises. And for now, those promises are still being kept. Not because we want to, but because we have to. This is a hypothetical scenario based on the historical record. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict.